Today, Augusto Lopez Claros will be speaking to us. Currently, he is on leave from the World Bank and is a senior fellow at the Edward Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, right in Washington, D.C. He has been up through really last year, and I suppose again next year, back at the World Bank, director of the World Bank's Global Indications Group, the department responsible for the bank's doing business report and other international benchmarking studies. Previously, he was chief economist and director of the Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, where he was also editor of the Global Competitiveness Report, the forum's flagship publication, and various regional economic reports as well. Before joining the forum, he worked several years in the financial sector in London with special focus on emerging markets. And then, of course, he was the International Monetary Fund's resident representative in the Russian Federation during the 1990s. And if anyone is old enough to remember the 1990s, that was a very interesting time in the Russian Federation and a time of great economic change. And Augusto was right there at the center helping to manage it. And I had the privilege of visiting him in Moscow at that time as well, which was really quite a marvelous experience. So, without any further delay, I would like to turn everything over to Augusto so that he can begin to give us his presentation about the issues of economic class differences and ways to reduce them.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much for your kind introduction and for reminding me of your visit to Moscow in the 1990s, which brings back fond memories. What I'd like to do today is basically divide my remarks in three parts. I would like to basically raise the question of how serious is the problem of inequality. And in particular, I would like to share with you some interesting data and metrics that economists in organizations like the World Bank and in other places use to define and to get a sense of the problem of inequality in the world. Then, in the second part of my presentation, I'd like to say, why is the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty such an important principle within the teachings of the Baha'i faith? And then in the third part of my remarks, I would like to talk a little bit about solutions, both solutions advocated by the faith, in particular Abdu'l-Bahá, who came to the subject frequently, especially during his travels in America in 1912, and of course beyond the faith, leading experts, because given the prominence of the issue in recent years, as you can imagine, it has generated a great deal of debate within the economics profession and within those people working on development issues. So on the metrics and on how serious the problem is, let me begin by saying that it's a technically complex subject, and at times it has been mired in controversy among experts. People mean different things when they talk about inequality. For instance, some people think of inequality as that which exists between countries. However, it is possible to talk about inequality in the context of a single country. Brazil has 206 million people, and a legitimate question is, how is income distributed among its 206 million inhabitants? There are some experts who say, no, let's look at equality on a global scale, abstract from national boundaries, look at the entire population of the world, all 7.5 billion people, and ask the question, how is income distributed among the entire world's population? And so the first warning that I want to give you is that when you talk about inequality with experts, with colleagues, with friends, you need to pin down, what it is that they mean when they're talking about inequality. Which particular definition are they focusing on? Which particular concept of inequality are they referring to? Second point I wanted to make here is that there is a difference between income distribution, which is what we're going to talk about today, and poverty. which very often is part of the debate about inequality. Let me share with you, just for a minute or so, some interesting data on poverty. You will often hear experts, some of the senior officials of organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and other regional development banks. You will often hear that there has been considerable progress in reducing the incidence of extreme poverty, say, since the early 1990s. And indeed, if you look at the data on extreme poverty, it is the case, it is true. In 1990, if you use the definition of extreme poverty used by the World Bank, which is a daily income of $1.90 per person, in 1990, there were close to 2 billion people who could be classified as extremely poor. By 2013, this figure had come down to a little bit less than 800 million people. And so this led to many experts to say, look, this is notable. This is a very impressive progress. We have done quite a bit in terms of reducing the incidence of extreme poverty. But even this result, which is factual, is not free of controversy, because you will hear some people come and say, yes, but wait a minute, much of that reduction, probably 90% of that reduction, is accounted for by China, which, as you know, has been growing very rapidly in the last 20, 30 years. And as a result of that economic growth, it has brought hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. Other people will come and say, yes, 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 we have had progress in this area, but if you don't use such an austere poverty line as $1.90 per day, which is really extremely tough, if you move the poverty line to, say, something a little bit more reasonable, like $3.20 per person per day, it turns out that in 2013, there were close to 2 billion people that could be classified as being poor, which is, of course, a big number. It's a significant proportion of the world's population. And then there are other economists. Nancy Birdsall, a very prominent American economist, a very distinguished economist, says, no, actually, even 320 is too tough. If you use a poverty line of $5.50, half of the world's population is actually poor. And she characterizes people who live under $5.50 as being strugglers. That is the term that she uses. These are people who have constant difficulties from day to day making ends meet on $5.50, and so on. So the debate on poverty and these numbers that I have shared with you are indicative of the care that one has to have sometimes in interpreting figures. And then just my final point on poverty is that because much of the progress has indeed been on account of China, if you look at data for poverty in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, there has actually been an increase in the number of poor over the last 30 years because of population growth. And so even on the poverty side, it's a very mixed picture. Now, inequality, which is what we're going to talk about, is a different subject altogether. You can have progress on poverty reduction, and at the same time, simultaneously, you can have a worsening of income distribution trends in the country or in the world at large. And what I like to do is to share 3 or 4 bits of interesting data. I'm an economist, and for me, data and facts are tremendously important. They illumine the debate around these issues. And so what I will try to do in the next 2-3 minutes is give you 3 or 4 pieces of data which hopefully will persuade you that in terms of inequality, we do have a very serious problem in the world today. All right, so let me begin with the first bit. Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the regions of the world that we very much are concerned with at the World Bank. It is the region of the world that has the largest pockets of poverty. And in 2016, it had a population of close to 1 billion people, about 980 billion people. And these, close to 50 countries in Africa had a combined gross national product of about $1.5 trillion. Switzerland and the Netherlands, two relatively smallish countries in Europe, with a population of about 25 million people, which is less than 3% of the population of the entire African continent, have a GDP that is roughly equivalent to the GDP of the 50 nations in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a very telling statistic, that two small countries with a relatively small population could in fact be producing as much wealth as the entire African continent. Gives you an idea of the concentration of wealth in the world today. In fact, there are some enterprising economic historians who have looked at the data that we have, from the early 19th century, and they have come up with a very interesting sort of metric. If you look at the high-income countries, specifically the United States and Canada in North America, all the members of the European Union, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, and you ask yourself, what has happened from 1820, which is basically the early beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, to the present, with income per capita, it turns out that income per capita in those countries has grown roughly 19, 20 times. However, income per capita in the rest of the world, everywhere else other than those countries, Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and so on, income per capita during the same period, the last couple of hundred years essentially, has grown by about 5 times. And over a period of 2 centuries, the difference between 19 times and 5 times essentially has been reflected in a huge divergence between the rich developed nations of the early 19th century and the rest of the world. Why this has happened is an interesting question, but I won't focus on that now because I have a lot of other ground that I want to cover. But if you're interested, we can come to that question during the Q&A period. The reasons behind this massive divergence between the high-income countries and the rest of the world. Let me give you another metric that looks at the issue of inequality from a slightly different perspective. You know that, again, go back to 1820, which is early part of the 19th century, and you ask yourself, for those countries for which we have data, which are about 26 countries or so, mainly the high-income countries at that time, ask yourself, what was the ratio of the income per capita of the richest country to the poorest country in that group? Do you follow me? In other words, for those 26 countries in 1820, pick the wealthiest average income per capita in that country. I suppose it would have been the United Kingdom. Pick the poorest income per capita and find that ratio. And it turns out that that ratio is 3. Right? In other words, the richest country was on average about 3 times richer than the poorest country. Repeat the exercise in 1992. By then, of course, we have more countries, but that's okay. By 1992, that ratio of the average income of the richest country to the poorest country had risen to 72. And if you repeat the exercise for 2016, that ratio has gone up to 141. So again, these numbers, 3, 72, 141 over a period of 2 centuries, just give you an idea of the massive divergence in income per capita between the rich income world and the low income countries. I want to give you a kind of a slightly different perspective on this. A former colleague of mine at the IMF, must have been 2-3 years ago, he wrote an editorial in the Financial Times of London And the title of that editorial caught my eye. It was called The Golden Age of Growth. And I read the piece, it was interesting, and it made a point which was undebatable. Essentially, he said that, look, for the last 20 years, the low-income countries, that is, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the poor, least developed nations of the world, have been growing at roughly twice the rate of the high-income countries, the Germanys and the Japans and the Frances of this world. And that's factual. It is true. If you look at the data, that's exactly what has happened. And he said, there is a process of convergence underway because arithmetically, if the low-income countries are growing more quickly than the high-income countries, they will catch up. Hence the title of his piece, The Golden Age of Growth. He essentially was suggesting that we have resolved the problem. All we need to do is wait a bit. However, his piece didn't actually say anything about how long this catch-up process was going to take. And so I put a couple of research assistants in my team to work on this issue. We did some simulations, and I'd just like to share with you the results of that simulation, because they highlight, I think in a very dramatic way, the kinds of problems that we face today. All right. So the exercise is a very simple one. Just bear with me a second. I will take you by the hand. It's really a very simple, very intuitive exercise, which I think you will find appealing. Take the high-income countries in the world. Countries like Japan and France and Spain and Hungary and the United States and so on. There are a big bunch. There are several dozen of them in the world. And ask yourself, what is the average income per capita of those countries in 2016? And it turns out that it's close to $41,000. That's why they're high income. Do the same for the low-income countries, the poorest of the poor, countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Haiti and in other parts of the developing world. It turns out that this number is, in 2016, $600 per year. So there is a huge gap, as you can imagine, $41,000 versus $600. Now, what you do is you run a simulation. You say, assume that the high-income countries grow for the foreseeable future at 2.6% per year, which is what they have been growing at for the last 20 years. Assume that the low-income countries grow at 4.7% per year for the foreseeable future, which is what they have registered during the past 20 years. And so the question to you is, what do you think happens with this gap, with the difference in income between these two groups? Well, it turns out that the gap widens for years and years and years and decades to come, because essentially you are applying a small percentage, 2.6, to a very large number, $41,000. And you're applying a larger percentage, 4.7%, to a very small number, which is $600. So if you do the simulation, the gap widens, and it widens well into the next century. In fact, this is, as you can imagine, a simulation, so you need to take the numbers with a grain of salt. But this gap widens until the year 2197, so towards the end of the next century, and then there is a process of convergence, and the incomes of these two groups converge sometime in the 23rd century. This exercise, done in an earlier version by Thomas Homer Dixon, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, he characterizes as the dirty little secret of development economics. He says, this is what economists in the developing profession don't like to point out, and he calls it a dirty little secret, right? And it's obvious why this matters a great deal. If you are a mother in Burundi or in Sierra Leone, and you have aspirations for your children, so that one day they will have access to the same opportunities, education and health and so on, as children in Sweden and in Germany, it is not a very encouraging message if your head of state tells you, well, be patient. sometime in the next couple of 100 years, we will catch up. Therefore, don't be surprised if this mother or parents decide, we don't want to wait that long. What we're going to do is we're going to pack our bags, and we're to migrate to Sweden or to Northern Europe, legally, or as often happens, illegally. And this is, of course, facilitated by the fact that other migrants who have moved to Sweden, Germany, and other such countries have written back home and have said, look, life is great here. Our income has increased remarkably. We have found newfound opportunities here. And this is, in fact, what lies behind, the current debate on migration. Some of it is linked to political and security crisis in the Middle East, but a lot of the migratory movements in the world today are linked to aspirations and people's responses to these huge income gaps between the well-off rich nations and the nations that are at the other end of the income distribution. And of course, as you well know, these migratory flows have led to populism. They have led to a rise in demagoguery in many of the recipient countries, and have become a problem that will have to be managed in some way over the next several decades, because the incentives are going to be firmly in place for a long, long time to come. All right, so look, there's a lot more data that I could share with you about, sort of the extent of income inequality. Maybe just quickly in passing, I mentioned one last bit before going to the second part of my presentation. If you look at the gains in global income in the last 30 years, in other words, just ask yourself, we are much richer today than we were 30 years ago. If you ask, of those gains in income, what is the distribution? It turns out that 62% of the gains in global income over the last 30 years were concentrated on the top 1% of the population, right? So that's, again, the top 1% of the income distribution. So that's again very perturbing. Now, Abdu'l-Bahá, to move on to the second part of my presentation, when he was traveling in America in 1912, he came repeatedly to this issue of income disparities and extremes of wealth and poverty. For instance, on the 6th of May of 1912 in Cleveland, he referred to the Bible and the term in the Bible, the New Jerusalem. And he interpreted that term and he said, the New Jerusalem means, and I quote, a readjustment of the economic order that will come about. And then he means specifically a narrowing of income differentials. And I have often wondered, why did he come so frequently back to this issue? And I will share with you a couple more quotes in a minute, but it seems to me that one of the reasons was that conditions in America in 1912 were really, if you think about it, compared to today, quite dire. In 1912 in America, there were no systems of social protection. Pensions, Medicaid, Medicare, all those things, came much later. They started out with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, partly in response to the calamities of the U.S. Great Depression. In 1912, if you lost your job, you might not be able to eat the following day. There was no safety net to speak of. And there were large numbers of very poor people in America, to say nothing of the rest of the world, which was in a very, very dark condition. And so Abdu'l-Bahá sensed this. He looked at this. He saw around, as he was traveling, he saw the evidences of this in multiple ways. A bit later in New York, in July of that year, July 1st, in fact, he said, I quote, one of the Baha'u'llah's teachings is the adjustment of means of livelihood in human society. There can be no extremes in human conditions as regards wealth and sustenance. And I will only share with you a couple more, although there are several others. it was clearly very much present in Abdu'l-Bahá's mind as he was traveling in America, this issue of social justice and the question of what he called the need for a new economic order that would be based on justice and equity. In Philadelphia, a few weeks before, in June, he said one of the greatest. He referred to income inequality, and he said it is one of the greatest importance, in as much as it ensures the stability of the world. And here he is, highlighting for us that inequality is doesn't just have an ethical dimension. It's not just about fairness in the distribution of the fruits of prosperity, but in fact that to the extent that we neglect it, it will affect stability in the world, which of course I think has become dramatically true today. In New Jersey, in May of that year, he said, the rich are deprived of eternal happiness, for eternal happiness is contingent upon giving, and the poor are everywhere in the state of abject need. So here, again, he brings a kind of a spiritual dimension to the debate about income distribution, calling upon the rich to say, it is your responsibility to help those around you who are in a much in a great state of need. And then in that same talk in New Jersey, he talked about the burdens of wealth management, and compare this to the fact that poverty very often is not just absence or low income, but it brings with it stress and suffering and misery, bringing in then therefore this psychological dimension to poverty, which very often people neglect. Poverty is not just having low income. Poverty brings with it suffering and stress and difficulties, and I will have a few examples of this in a couple of minutes. Of course, earlier Baha'u'llah himself in his tablets to the kings and the rulers had spoken extensively about their responsibility for the poor and the downtrodden. And you will remember the series of meetings that Baha'u'llah had with Professor Brown in Bahá'í in 1890. And Brown has left for posterity an account of those meetings. And in one of those, he quotes Baha'u'llah as saying the following. He said, "However, we see your kings and rulers spending their treasures more in means for the destruction of the human race than in that which would confer happiness to humanity." Brown doesn't elaborate on this point. He doesn't say, and Baha'u'llah further added that these are the things that confer happiness to humanity, but we can guess from other writings of the central figures of the faith. For instance, in The Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Bahá, of course, talks extensively about education, about expanding the frontiers of knowledge. And therefore one can speculate that when Baha'u'llah was telling Brown about those things which would confer happiness to humanity, he was in fact referring to such things as making more resources available for education, because both him and Abdu'l-Bahá regarded education and training and knowledge as tremendously important for human development. And as I said, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke in The Secret of Divine Civilization about expanding the frontiers of knowledge. In that treatise, he also spoke about the acquisition of know-how and technology as being tremendously important for human development and as being essential to empower the government, to play a more active role in promoting economic and social development. I'd like to say a few things now about solutions. This is a very serious problem. You have heard me quote some of the statements made by Abdu'l-Bahá at various times during his travels in America. Well, in many of those talks, he actually talked about solutions, and it's really quite touching and encouraging to see how he understands that he must go beyond simply highlighting the problem, that it is important that also solutions be presented. One of them that he comes back to is the whole question of progressive taxation. He says that tax rates should rise as income rises. It is really quite extraordinary that Abdu'l-Bahá talked about progressive taxation at a time when most of the developed nations of the world had actually much more primitive systems of taxation. The idea of progressive taxation is something that came later on. Just for a technical point, progressive taxation, as opposed to, say, a flat tax, which is what some countries in the world have today. In Estonia or in Russia, for instance, the tax system is flat. If you earn, to take the example of Estonia, 20,000 euros per year, you pay a flat tax of 13%. If you earn 2 million euros per year, you pay a tax of 13%. Everybody pays the same tax. That is not progressive taxation. Progressive taxation is basically a system such as we have today in the United States and other rich high-income countries, and many countries in the developing world, where as your income rises, the tax rate that gets applied to that rising income increases. And this is a way essentially to empower the government to collect the revenue or more revenue, so that it can play in a better, more efficient way, the role of distributor. Because in an economy, it is still the case in most countries that the largest pocket of resources is basically what is collected by the government through the tax system. So if we're going to talk about reducing income inequality, we have to talk inevitably about how to enhance the ability of the government to play the role of distributor within the economy. In fact, if you look at the countries with low levels of inequality, I'm thinking of countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Japan and France and others. These are the countries that have some of the lowest Gini coefficients in the world. The Gini coefficient is a metric that is used by economists to measure inequality. A low Gini is good, a high Gini is bad. These countries have very, very importantly, very effectively used the ability of the government to tax to essentially generate resources which then can be used to create a safety net, to introduce social protections, to finance public health and public education, to improve the country's infrastructure and so on, in ways that over time have led to a better distribution of income. So progressive taxation was very much a part of the solution presented by Abdu'l-Bahá to deal with the issue of income inequality, but not the only one. He actually had at least a couple of others. He spoke about the need for well-trained and honest public servants. This issue of integrity in public service is very much present in The Secret of Divine Civilization. On the issue of training, well, the argument is a very simple one. If you have a well-trained civil service, if you have well-trained, educated public servants, they will be much better able to formulate, good public policies. Very often, many of the problems that we see in the developing world have to do with public servants and government employees and other people who are in the centers of power who don't have the capacity to formulate good public policies. And this gets reflected again in inequalities and poverty and in other social problems. And in terms of honesty and integrity in public service, well, over the last several decades, the evidence that economists have accumulated about the dire economic consequences of corruption is overwhelming. I myself have written on the subject, and in my website, I have a fairly comprehensive paper that was published in an academic journal a couple of years ago on the impact and the consequences and what to do about corruption. But I can understand very well why Abdu'l-Bahá drilled the subject so frequently and so persistently in The Secret of Divine Civilization. He doesn't mention explicitly, some of the consequences which economists talk about today, such as undermining the ability of the government to collect revenue, undermining economic growth, increasing uncertainty, increasing inequality, undermining the credibility of the government, and so on. This is not a talk about corruption, so I will stop here, but let me simply say that Abdu'l-Bahā's emphasis on honesty and integrity in that treatise was extremely well justified. Abdu'l-Bahá also talked about profit sharing. Again, it's unusual for this when you think that the context, 1912. Profit sharing, yes, people discuss that today, 100 years later. There are industries where, in fact, it is a fairly widespread practice, such as in the financial sector, for instance, but that he should be arguing, as he did then, that, I quote, owners should share their incomes with their employees, that the employees may receive, beside their wages, some of the general income of the factory, so that the employee may strive with his soul in the work, and so on and so forth. He has a number of such quotes, and essentially what they have to do, as I see it, is creating a system in which there is a better alignment of the interests of owners and workers. At the time that Abdu'l-Bahá was traveling in America, there was a huge debate in Europe and in other places about capital and labor, and about, how to reconcile those interests. Well, Abdu'l-Bahá is saying, look, profit sharing is one way to do it. Because if, in addition to giving workers their monthly salary, you also give them a share of the profits, you essentially turn them into shareholders of the company, then they will work for your company or your factory with a degree of dedication that goes well beyond the present system, where they simply feel exploited because you are paying them, subsistence wages. So that was, I thought that was a kind of a brilliant contribution of Abdu'l-Bahá to this whole debate about income distribution and what to do about it. Let me move on to a few more ideas, and I will begin by sort of provoking you a little bit. Because I will touch upon something that has become a very hot issue in the economics profession today. And I would like to say, and you may disagree with me, that the idea that I'm about to put forward to you is something that is very much consistent with Abdu'l-Bahā's thinking as he was traveling in America in 1912. All right, so what do I have in mind? Let me sort of step back and point something out to you. If you are born in Norway today, what kind of future can you expect? Well, Norway is a very high income country. It's a resource-rich country. It's an oil producer. It is a country that has impeccably honest government. All the indicators of corruption, Norway is always at the top with flying colors, very little corruption. So if you're born in Norway, you can expect to have a long life, to have access to education and other kinds of opportunities. And actually, because the Norwegian government has been very savvy in the management of its public resources, at the moment they have like $1 trillion in savings for a country of 5 million people, to make sure that they will be able to fulfill their commitments to the population in terms of health expenditures, pension systems, and the very widespread safety net that they have created, right? So, of course, as you know, we don't get to choose who our parents are, and therefore we don't get to choose where we're born. That is an accident in our lives. It happens. I was born in Bolivia, and if you ask me, had I been given a choice, would I have opted for Norway? It's likely that I might have. Now, if you are born in Chad or in Burundi or in Sierra Leone or some of the other countries, let's say in Sub-Saharan Africa, what are your chances? What is the outlook for you? Well, I don't want to exaggerate, but it is fairly dramatic. You're lucky if you make it past the age of 1. infant mortality in these countries is sky high, you are going to be very limited in terms of the possibilities that you have for getting a good education. Many of these countries are mired not just in poverty, they are mired in civil conflict, in disturbances, unstable, corrupt governments, and so on. So the outlook for you if you're born in Chad is considerably darker than if you're born in Norway. So the question is this fair? And of course, the obvious answer to this question is no, it's not fair. It is not fair, but it's such is the world as we have. Now, I ask you, would it not be better to live in a world in which, regardless of where you are born, you have access to a certain minimum level of opportunities and goods and services, where perhaps you have access to, let's say, nutrition, basic education, shelter, health, some of the things that make a difference in terms of enhancing your opportunities over your lifetime and turning you into a kind of a productive, happy citizen. It is this kind of debate which recently has led many people to propose or put forward the notion of creating what is called a universal basic income, which is essentially a minimum level of income that would be accessible to people in, let's say, a country, regardless of their social condition. The issue is very controversial, but I want to share with you, just as an anecdote, a kind of an interesting experiment. I use the word experiment in quotes here, and you will see why in a minute. In North Carolina, an Indian reservation in North Carolina. These are the facts of this interesting case, and you'll see in a minute why I'm sharing this with you. It has a bearing on this debate about universal basic income. It turns out that a few decades ago, this reservation opened up a casino, and this casino, gambling being an addiction in many parts of the United States, became very profitable over time. And at some point, the elders in the reservation needed to decide what they were going to do with the profits that were generated by the casino. And they decided that what they were going to do is just distribute the profits to the members of the reservation, regardless of personal circumstances. Every member, man, woman, and child, old or young, would get the same amount as a kind of an annual subsidy. As the casino expanded and became more profitable, this amount of money received by each person in the reservation rose over time. And so it will not surprise you that some enterprising academics at Duke University decided to realize that here was a very interesting controlled experiment underway, because there was very rich data prior to the emergence of the casino and the associated income to its members. There was data on high school graduation rates, incidence of domestic violence, incidence of alcoholism and drug abuse, rates of unemployment, and so on and so forth. And then after several years of the members of the reservation receiving this subsidy from the casino, it was possible to compile the same data and look at what had happened to all these indicators of welfare in the reservation. And much to the surprise, perhaps, of the researchers, what they discovered is that graduation rates were up. The incidence of domestic violence was down. The incidence of alcohol abuse and drug abuse was down. There were numerous examples of entrepreneurship. Little companies and businesses that had been established by members of the reservation with the money that they had saved from the subsidy. please don't misunderstand me. I'm not making a case here for gambling as a source of subsidies for the population. That just happened to be a characteristic of the Indian reservation. The point here is that rather than creating a culture of dependency, rather than turning the members of the reservation into lazy people who would be using their subsidy to watch television 10 hours a day, the subsidy actually had very positive repercussions in terms of enhancing opportunity and improving all of these social indicators, which for the reservation in previous years had been, quite dire. And so, to me, the idea of rethinking our public policies in a way that would make universal basic income a reality in the future is something worth considering. I think it is very much part of the solution over the longer term. Now, the issue is controversial. If I'm going to be honest with you, I have to tell you, the economics profession and policymakers are divided over this issue across the planet. There was a referendum in Switzerland a couple of years ago about the introduction of universal basic income, and it was defeated. And one of the reasons why people were concerned about it was basically the cost. Is this something that we can afford? As you can imagine, being Switzerland, the monthly income was very high. It was a bit less than 3,000 Swiss francs per month, which, if you think about it, is a very large sum of money. And so it was a legitimate concern. Is this affordable? Is this something that can be sustained over time? There are concerns about the kinds of impact that is going to have on incentives. Is it going to turn the population, into lazy people who don't want to work because they are receiving access to this basic minimum income from which they can fund, basic necessities? Certainly, the experience of the Indian reservation very much casts doubt on this idea that simply because people will receive a small subsidy, they will become lazy and unproductive. In fact, in the case of the Indian reservation, it was quite the opposite. It led to entrepreneurship. It led to, I think it basically addressed one important issue, which is that poverty with it brings very often frustrations. It brings stress. It brings misery. And it should not surprise to people that when that happens, there are problems of domestic violence and alcoholism and drug abuse and so on. Let me mention sort of 2 or 3 other ideas to conclude. And let me make an aside here. Boyd, can you hear me? Are we still connected?
I can hear you. I'm assuming Boyd just has his microphone turned off.
Okay, fine. I heard a sound in the screen, and for a minute I thought that perhaps we had been disconnected.
Oh, it was a ding dong. I heard it too.
Okay, fine. Let me just quickly add two more ideas. Things that at the moment we could be doing that we are not on a global scale. And I'm looking at my watch, and I don't want to run out of time, so I will move quickly to end. At the moment in the world, according to an IMF study of 2015, countries are spending something like $5.3 trillion per year subsidizing the consumption of gasoline, electricity, carbon, natural gas. This is about 6.5% of world GNP on an annual basis. Now, 60% of the benefits of these subsidies are actually going to the 20% top of the income distribution. And again, think of the intuition behind this. Who benefits from gasoline subsidies in, say, a country like India? Is it the poor, illiterate Indian villager, women villager, Or is it those people with cars driving in huge traffic jams in New Delhi and some of the larger cities? It is the latter, of course. So this is a policy subsidizing energy, which actually makes income inequality worse in the world. It moves us in exactly the opposite direction that we want to move in. Furthermore, the IMF says that if all energy subsidies were eliminated in the world overnight, it would lead to a 20% reduction in emissions. So these subsidies are actually hastening the climate change and global warming. So it would be difficult to come up with a worse, more horrible, misguided public policy, and yet it is taking place on an annual basis everywhere. I won't tell you, because we don't have the time, what you could do from a development perspective with $5.3 trillion in the world. In a world, by the way, where we have 800 million people who can't read and write, we have 815 million people who are malnourished. You know, it's just a travesty in some way. All right. Second point. We live in a world in which there is no collective security mechanism. The world order that was created in the 1940s and that came into being in 1945 with the UN Charter basically does not provide for collective security. Therefore, we have 193 United Nations members who have to spend propping up their military establishments, building up their armies, their air forces, their navies, and so on, because of some perceived or imaginary threats. And so you get in, you have situations like the case of a country in Latin America, whose name I will not mention, which a couple of decades ago spent like $1 billion modernizing its air force. Now I ask you, you're not an economist, most of you, but I ask you, what do you think are the benefits, the economic benefits for a nation of spending $1 billion modernizing its air force? Will it surprise you if I tell you that the benefits are null or zero, in fact, are negative, because very often these monies are spent by assuming debt obligations. Very often spending this kind of money on defense involves contracts for spare parts. They involve contracts for training the pilots and so on. They are a heavy burden on the budget for years and years to come after the money has been spent and the liability has been acquired. So it is for this reason that the IMF calls much of defense spending unproductive, you know, with a typical understatement. So, you know, Shoghi Effendi, in many of his writings, comes to this issue. He talks about the enormous energy dissipated and wasted on war. He talks about the curse of war and its miseries. He dreams and calls for the day when we will not have to spend such vast amounts building machinery for the destruction of the human race, to quote Baha'u'llah, and we will be able to redirect those resources to education, to public health, to addressing the issues of income inequality, which are so dire today. And then one final idea, although there are several more, but I am running out of time. One final idea, which I want to leave with you to conclude, is the whole question of gender inequality. You know, we often don't think of gender inequality as having anything to do with income inequality. But it turns out that there is very compelling data that suggests that when countries use the law, the Constitution, the Civil Code, family law, the tax code, the labor code, other pieces of legislation to discriminate against women, to undermine her ability to join the labor force, to undermine her property rights, to limit her mobility, and to do the dozens and dozens and dozens of things which countries are doing literally every day of the year all over the world to discriminate against women. The data suggests that this is actually bad for inequality. And it makes eminent sense. You don't have to be an economist to understand the intuition behind it. If you are discriminating against half of the population in some fashion, if you are preventing her from making her contribution to welfare and to prosperity, obviously productivity is going to undermine, competitiveness will be undermined. And at the World Bank, we have discovered that the Gini coefficients for these countries that have these discriminations against women are actually higher. That means inequality is worse. Income is worse, is more poorly distributed. So here is one area where there is an alignment of two very important principles of the Baha'i teachings. One is the equality of men and women, and the other one is the elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty. Okay, look, I think I've spoken long enough, and I think maybe this is the time to turn it back to Robert. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Augusto. This was fascinating. I love talks that are filled with specifics, and I can count on economists generally to be that way. And I very much always appreciate the numbers that you are able to provide and the specific details and examples that you're able to provide. Let me see what we have in terms of questions. We do have quite a few already, which is good. Though I'll ask a question first, if I may. One thing you didn't mention is healthcare. And it seems to me that there's a tablet of Abdu'l-Bahá about the village storehouse where he talks about progressive income tax. And one of the things the village storehouse is supposed to do is to help provide healthcare. And that obviously helps avoid a lot of major economic disasters nowadays, especially in Abdu'l-Bahā's days. Medicine obviously didn't cost as much as it does today, but it seems to me that's another thing that helps to close the gap between extremes of wealth and poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this idea of a minimum standard of life, right, or minimum standard of living, that people simply by the very fact that they have been born into this world, you know, should be entitled to some basic necessities, you know, such as nutrition, education, health, housing, perhaps, you know, has powerful appeal, not just among Baha'is, obviously, because it seems to bring in it a notion of fairness and justice, but more generally across the world. It's an idea that is catching up because it's a way in which people are saying that, you know, we need to focus more on the question of inequality and poverty in the world. You know? So the issue of affordability is a very important one, and you will very often see economists who will tell you this is a pipe dream. You don't know what you're talking about because, in fact, most countries are not going to be able to afford to do this. And the answer to that question is essentially, look at the massive waste of resources which you can identify in other areas. You know, we're talking about big pockets. You know, this issue of energy subsidies, you know, that sum is actually higher on an annual basis than total defense spending in the world. We're talking about massive amounts which are essentially being wasted and are making the problem of income distribution worse because they're going to the top end of the income distribution. So the issue of affordability is a legitimate question, but it is not something that can be used simply to dismiss the idea of eventually introducing universal basic income. Also, I think that one of the reasons why the issue has become somewhat controversial is because, for me, universal basic income is something that should be discussed today, not for the Switzerlands and the Finlands of this world, but for the very poor, for the countries where you have the largest pockets of poverty, the largest pockets of malnutrition and other limitations. No?
Yeah, and there's been some interest. I think there have been some experiments, I think was in West Africa, with providing people with a couple of $100 to see what they would do with it. And a lot of people were very entrepreneurial with that money also and used it to create businesses or to just generally improve the lives of their families.
Yeah.
Bill asks, can we assume that economic development will continue? What is the impact of resource depletion, continued population growth, and climate change? This gets into the whole issue of, is it a good idea that 100 years from now the world GDP will be 10 times bigger than it is today?
It's a very important question. It's, you know, and it's the right question to raise. However, one of the reasons why I wanted to mention that comparison between the entire GDP of sub-Saharan Africa and the GDP of Switzerland and Netherlands is basically to suggest or to propose to you that we have to find a way to continue to allow, especially the poor countries of the world, you know, to grow and prosper. Whether it is desirable for the high-income countries, you know, to continue to grow at 2.5–3% per year over the longer term, that's a legitimate question, and we get into the issues of sustainability, because the claim that the high-income countries make on world resources are, of course, much larger than the claim that the poor, low-income African countries make on world resources, right? So that is a very legitimate question. You know, are we in fact on a development that is sustainable, and if not, you know, how do we get back on a sustainable path, and what are the responsibilities between the high income countries on the one hand and, you know, the very poor on the other? You know, it's interesting, but there are a lot of studies which actually suggest that, at least in the high income countries, additional gains in income are not correlated with additional gains in satisfaction and happiness and well-being. That you're familiar with that literature. It used to be a quaint literature 20 years ago to talk about subjective well-being and happiness. Today is very legitimate. You know, a psychologist has won a Nobel Prize a few years ago, Daniel Kahneman, you know, writing on this very subject. And essentially, the idea is that, to take the example of Japan, Japan is much richer today than it was 30 years ago. And yet the surveys that have been done about satisfaction, happiness, fulfillment, show that they are no happier today than they were 30 years ago. And so this raises, you know, fundamental questions about our economic model, especially for the high-income countries, right? What does happiness depend on at $50,000 per year in Japan and in the developed countries? Well, it seems to depend on relationships, on friendships, you know, joy at work, other kinds of non-tangibles, which have little to do with, you know, how much money you make on a monthly basis. But in Africa, where in average income in the low-income countries is $600 per year, additional gains in income do lead to improvements in well-being and happiness, because they can make a dramatic difference in terms of your children's mortality, in terms of your ability to educate and provide satisfy the basic needs of your family, right? And so, for me, you know, we need to basically internalize in our public policies the fact that, you know, we have huge diversion of income, and that what makes sense in Africa may not be the same thing that makes sense in Sweden or Germany.
Sure. Yeah, it seems to me, if I remember, if we had 3% growth per year, according to the rule of 72, that's doubling every 24 years, and in a century, that's 4 doublings. And if we have $50,000 per capita income in the U.S. now, multiply that by 16, that would be $800,000 per year per person in a century from now. What would people do with that much money? Well, I'm sure they would spend it. They would have houses that would be 5 times bigger than they are now, and they would have all kinds of extra rooms and all that. But what's the point, you know? And meanwhile, the people in Africa might be getting up to $20,000 a year instead, and might still have a lot of the problems they have now with infrastructure and with disease, especially, it seems to me. Bahar asks this interesting Baha'i question, and that's that, do you see a role of the huququllah, of the right of God, the Baha'i teaching of the huququllah, in reducing the extremes of wealth and poverty?
I guess over the longer term, yes, of course. You know, think of how have the countries that have been more successful in reducing income inequality, how have they done it, right? And incidentally, the European Union has been sort of much under attack in the last, 2, 3, 4 years because of all the recent developments. But very often people forget that the European Union has some of the lowest levels of inequality in the world. Some of the lowest Gini coefficients are actually in countries in the European Union. And why has this happened? Two things. First, within those countries, there are public policies which have strengthened social safety net protections. They have access to public health, they have access to free education. There has been a concerted effort to basically protect vulnerable groups in the population. They have progressive systems of taxations as well. In some cases quite onerous, like the Scandinavian countries are very high levels of taxation, and yet very little tax evasion, because there's integrity in government, so people pay their taxes because they know that they're going to benefit from those taxes. It's not going to be stolen away, it will be reinvested in infrastructure and education, public health, improving the skills of the labor force, and so on. So there is a kind of a virtuous relationship between the taxpayer and the government, right? But in the case of the European Union in particular, there is something else that has been happening for the last several decades, which is that they have a very explicit system of distribution from the rich countries to the poor countries. If you are a country with an average income per capita which is below the mean of the European Union, you get transfers from the European Union. And this has been transformative. I can tell you, when I was a young economist in the IMF, I was the country economist for Spain. And so I used to go on IMF missions to Madrid, for discussions with the government, just at the time when Spain was entering the European Union. And at that time, Spain and Portugal were sort of the poor cousins of Europe. They had poor infrastructure. They were, poor countries within that brotherhood or sisterhood. And yet over the next, 20, 25 years, Spain and Portugal, were dramatically transformed as a result of these subsidies which came from the north, from the rich countries in the north. And this contributed to narrow income differences between these countries. And so inequality is amenable to good public policies. And there are many things which we could do in the world to address this issue, which we're not doing at the moment. And instead we're wasting resources massively elsewhere.
Yeah. I was in Spain in 2000, and I was amazed at how beautiful the highways were. They were all new. They were just fantastic. And of course, they were incredible railroads and everything. And the phone system worked better than the American phone system too, for that matter, from what I can.
Actually, on the hukukula, which I forgot to come to the conclusion, the hukukula in the future, as the Baha'i community grows in numbers, as more people assume this spiritual responsibility and make their contribution, could represent a very substantial volume of resources, which then the head of the Baha'i community can use for purposes of development, for projects, for education, for empowering women and girls, and so on, right? So the answer is yes, of course. It is. I can imagine that the Hukukula Fund could play in that world exactly the same role that good governments play today with tax revenue, right? Which they use the tax revenue to narrow income differentials and provide basic protections to the population.
Bill asks, to what extent are the traditional schools of economic thought, neoclassical, macroeconomics, neo-Keynesian, these kinds of things, are they useful to address the issues you raise, or to what extent are they part of the problem?
I was born in Latin America at a time when there was this huge sort of ideological divide, right, between left and right, between capitalism and communism or socialism and so on. And I'm always reminded of that wonderful quote from Shoghi Effendi about humanity not being crucified for the sake of the preservation of a particular doctrine and school of thought, right? Which I always interpreted to mean that we have to be pragmatic. We have to really step aside from ideological debates about the system, about capitalism versus socialism and so on, and basically ask ourselves, what has in fact worked in countries? I am a great admirer, for instance, of the northern European countries. Over the last 6-7 years, I have been to Sweden at least a dozen times. In fact, one of my teams at the World Bank, we did together a study for the Swedish economy, looking at what are the challenges that they face over the next 10-15 years, having achieved so much already in a number of areas. And for me, this, it's a system that has very firmly embedded within the policy framework notions of solidarity. That we're not going to leave people behind. We're going to give opportunities to everybody, especially children, especially women, especially older people, unemployed people, and so on. It has firmly embedded in their public policies the notion of sustainability. Mm-hmm. This responsibility that we as citizens have for future generations. Let me give you an example of sustainability in Sweden, right? What happened after the 2008-2009 financial crisis in much of the advanced economies, in places like the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of the developed world? Massive spending, right? The governments went all the way out, essentially issuing public debt and spending and bailing out the banks and doing all kinds of interventions which were intended to protect the system from a total collapse, right?
Prop up the economy.
Yeah, but where has that led us? It has led us to a situation today where we have sky-high levels of debt, public indebtedness, right? We have wartime levels of public indebtedness without a war. You have to go back to 1946-47 at the end of World War II to see debt levels of debt that are as high as they are today. Not in Sweden. Not in Sweden. Why? Because the Swedish argue to themselves, look, this crisis is a shock to the system, but it doesn't take away the fact that we have an aging population, that there are needs that have to be met, there are commitments which this government has made that are going to come due 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. And therefore, we cannot simply spend our way out of this crisis by neglecting our responsibilities for the future, right? And so, for me, government will continue to be an important player in this debate. And I think that rather than get bogged down into Keynesians versus monetarists, capitalists versus socialists, the left versus the right, for me, a much more promising approach is to look at what has worked in countries and to see to what extent are some of those good policies, be replicated in other parts of the world.
Another bill asks, is there an option of top-down, essentially political reform? And then he says, could we not work towards greater self-sufficiency? I'm not sure what he means by self-sufficiency here. That's the question. Another person asks if you can't give a little more numbers to some of your statistics, to some of your examples. But you've given quite a few, of course, but that's another question.
Oh, I can give numbers to last several hours, but I was trying to strike a balance between numbers and ideas.
Right. Let's see. Hassan asks, is the current form of capitalism as practiced in the West the main cause of economic inequality?
That's a very interesting question. And I think that you may find my answer a little bit surprising. You know that if you go back to 1870, all right, and I will therefore give you some more numbers to the previous person, all right? If you have to go back to 1870 and you actually compare in today's dollars, income per capita in Japan, the United Kingdom, and Australia, it turns out that Japan was a poor country. it was well behind, well behind. There was a huge gap between the UK and Australia on the one hand and Japan on the other. And this is not surprising. Japan was coming out of the medieval culture of the samurais and so on. So it's a poor developing country. 100 years later, Japan has completely caught up with the United Kingdom and Australia. There is no difference to speak of, right? How they managed to do that is a fascinating story for which I don't have the time today, right? It's a fascinating story, which actually resonates very well with some of the ideas that Abdu'l-Bahá laid out in The Secret of Divine Civilization. Because a very important, powerful minister in Japan in 1870, Okubo Toshimichi, essentially did exactly the things that Abdu'l-Bahá was recommending that the Persians do in their own country. It is as though he had actually grabbed a copy of The Secret of Divine Civilization and said, yes, this is what I will do. I will adopt the technologies and the knowledge and the policies for the better countries. But I won't go into that story. But the point that I wanted to make is that if you just look at the high-income countries, there has been a massive process of convergence among them during the last 100 years. In other words, if you go back to 1870 and you make a listing of the rich countries and the poor countries, the poor countries like Japan have caught up with the rich countries like the United Kingdom and Australia. And people have asked, why did this happen? What is it about these countries that allow them to converge in such a way? And it turns out that the answer seems to be that, first, these countries were more open to trade and to investment. A lot of the success of Japan after 1870 was basically in opening up its economy to investment from abroad and to knowledge and technology and know-how and to trade in particular, right? Also, as they grew as a result of this opening up, they had more resources to educate their population and to spread knowledge and technology among them. And so eventually, they caught up. Now, the irony of these facts is that, of course, these countries, Japan and Germany and all the others, are very much what you would call the central of global capitalism. Mm-hmm. So I myself cannot argue credibly that the problem of inequality is linked, to the presence of capitalism in countries like Sweden and Spain and France and Japan. Because, in fact, these are the countries that have the lowest levels of inequality. Right?
Right. And you certainly can't argue from the experience of the Soviet Union that the lack of capitalism helped either.
Yeah, exactly.
Terrible situation that the people were in there in the 1970s and 80s, and the craziness. It seems to me, I heard that half the glass produced in the Soviet Union was broken before it ever got to market, and they were feeding pigs bread because they had subsidized the bread to make it poor people, make it easy for people to buy bread, so they were feeding it to animals too because it was cheaper than other things to pigs. Just the craziness that results when you don't have market forces shaping things.
Yeah.
Shala asks a basic question about corruption and conflict here. And she, first of all, asks whether providing a universal basic income would really reduce corruption. And she asks the question whether the ultra wealthy aren't always out to grab whatever assets they can from the poor and the middle class, including their labor, and therefore, they're part of the problem too, I guess would be her comment there.
Yeah, surely. I mean, it is one of the downsides of corruption that, when you have corrupt governments, very often this leads to the elites essentially appropriating policies for their benefits. They make sure that the tax system works in their favor. They act in other ways which preserve their interests and their power at the expense of the rest of society, which is the reason why corruption is so terrible for development. Not because I wrote it, but the paper I wrote on corruption, which is on my website, is actually a very nice, I think, synthesis of the issues. In that paper, I look at what are the causes of corruption. Where is corruption coming from? You know, why does it exist? Why has it become such a huge problem in the world today? Having done that, then I say, what are the consequences of corruption? What does corruption actually do in the world today? What are the prices that we're paying as a result of the spread of corruption? And then in the third part of the paper, I actually talk about what can we do about it? Are there things that we can do which actually would work? The countries that have managed to reduce corruption, how have they done it? Yeah. You know, it wasn't always the case that Sweden and Norway and other countries, were so squeaky clean. Corruption was 100 years ago, corruption was just as much of a problem there as it is in many other countries today. But in some way, they managed to tackle the problem. So there are things that can be done. And then in the last part of the paper, I actually look at the moral dimension of corruption, on which I have written a separate paper more recently. But it's a vast subject. I don't think I can do justice to it today. But if the reader is interested, he can go to that paper.
Yeah, it seems to me you just wrote it within the year and sent a link to a bunch of us. I'm going to have to read that paper myself. I was very interested when I saw the link come by. Alex asks, what shifts in mindset or consciousness are required to achieve global equality and eliminate these extremes? So long as we each are thinking of only our own utility, how can this be accomplished?
Yeah, this is, this brings in the ethical, spiritual dimension of inequality, which Abdu'l-Bahá was very careful to remind us of. Remember that quote that I shared with you, where he says that as long as we have abject poverty in the world, as long as we have millions and millions of people who don't have the basic necessities, the rich people themselves will not be able to be happy. There is a certain connection, between the members of the human family, and when there is great need, these spiritual connections act in a way that will undermine the happiness of the people who have the resources. So in a sense, he's saying it is in your self-interest to actually give up some of your wealth, to lighten the burden of poverty on the vast numbers of people in the world. And if you don't do that, then you won't be able to achieve eternal happiness. I find that very, very profound, and it brings us to the notions of solidarity, which Khashoggi Effendi refers to in his letters. The need of a new conception of human welfare. Bertrand Russell had a very interesting, very nice analogy, which I have sometimes used. Where he says that the notions of well-being today, have to become global in nature. He says when an individual is asked, how are you feeling? He responds in terms of the totality of his persona. He doesn't say, my liver is feeling good today, but my heart is not, right? Because that would be a very odd response. Because the individual is an integrated entity, and feelings of well-being are capturing the entire collectivity, his complete essence. So Russell says we need to develop concepts of well-being that basically become universal. That bring everybody into that concept, not just a particular national group, a particular ethnic group, a particular income segment.
Yeah, the concept of the oneness of humanity, it struck me, was one of the answers to Alex's question there. We have a few more questions, and I think we probably could go on since we have our audience is holding on here. Fareed Abdul-Wahid says, very interesting from the base level individuals. What about what John Perkins brings up? The system is based on greed and corruption. So is the discussion? So what's the solution to the greed and corruption of the whole system? I guess is his question. I don't know who John Perkins is. So
Again, this is a huge subject. In the paper which I referred to on corruption, I go into a number of ideas and issues that have been addressed, in attempts to deal with the issue of corruption. Let me give you just a couple. There are many there in the paper, but just in passing, I will mention two that have been tried quite successfully in some country contexts. One of the problems why you have corruption in many countries is because public servants are not paid a wage from which they can derive a kind of a dignified standard of living. Governments very often use the public sector as the employer of last resort, right? So instead of having a government, let's say, of 20,000 well-paid public servants who are well-trained and educated and have a sense of service to the community, they have 200,000 poorly paid employees who then, because they pay poorly, they then feel that they have to supplement their income by bribery and by other irregular channels. There are countries which have basically recognized that this is a perverse set of incentives and have actually professionalized the civil service and public employment, have raised levels of income so that people can live on those incomes without having to supplement them by irregular means. And this has reduced levels of corruption in these countries, right? So there are examples of that, and I talk about them in the paper, and I point out a few such cases. So this is one important part of the solution. Another solution, and there are many, but I'll just give you a couple. Another one is many countries are increasingly tapping into the latest technologies to close off avenues of corruption, which were very, very widespread in the world in the past and are still in some countries. Let me give you an example. Public procurement is a huge source of corruption in the world. Governments still are the biggest purchasers of goods and services in the economy. They purchase highways, they purchase machinery, paper clips, and so on. Spending on public procurement, on buying goods and services from the private sector, can be anywhere from 10 to 40% of GNP. It's a huge amount. All right. Some countries are basically, and of course, how does the corruption come in? Because there is a need. The government puts out a notice that it wants to buy 50 trucks, and then if this is done in a context of non-transparency, where the government official who has the power to decide does this in a way that allows the supplier to give him a kickback or a bribe or something like that, then it becomes widespread. Countries are moving more and more to electronic platforms where the only way in which you can sell anything to the government is through an electronic platform which is completely transparent and where there is no face-to-face meetings or relationships between the supplier on the one hand and the buyer of the good on the other, right? And so there's very, very explicit criteria, very, very clear framework. And in countries that have done this, corruption associated with public procurement has virtually disappeared, right? So there are things that can be done. We have to be inventive about it. It's interesting, Baha'is will find this interesting, when you actually read the literature on corruption, experts like Professor Rose Ackerman at Yale University, who is one of the world's leading experts on corruption, explicitly talk about systems where we have reward and punishment. Right? In other words, we have to come up with policies which reward good behaviors and punish the violation of rules and the law. And it reminds me, of course, of the similar statements made in the Baha'i writings about the importance of reward and punishment, and how these are two pillars of stability for the world order.
Absolutely. We are probably running out of time. There's a lot of questions, but we can't get to them. But I will allow one additional question, and that's from Bahia saying, could you please mention your new book on the equality of women, prosperity for all? And of course, we have a web talk on that coming up as well with you and Bahia Nakhjavani in February. So could you give us a little announcement about that, about the book and the talk?
If the Bahia that raised that question is my dear friend Bahia Nakhjavani, then I am happy. I'm happy to say something about our book. Our book.
Not that one. It's a different Bahia, and it is a Bahia I think, but it's not that Bahia.
Okay. Well, this is a book published by San Martin's Press a couple of weeks ago that is called Equality for Women Equals Prosperity for All, where essentially what Bahia Nakhjavani and I are trying to do is push the boundaries of the debate about gender inequality, a little bit sort of beyond where we are today, especially within the Baha'i community. We look at traditionally there has been a tendency to look at human rights from a gender equality from a human rights perspective, right? We are against gender inequality because it's a violation of women's rights. It goes against the Universal Declaration, the UN Charter, and other such founding documents, right? But in fact, gender inequality has multiple other dimensions. It turns out that it is bad economics. It's bad for human prosperity. It's bad for productivity. Countries that practice gender inequality, that discriminate against women, are actually shooting themselves in the foot and are falling behind other countries that have promoted women and have, sort of encouraged her participation into the labor force and so on and so forth. So we are looking at various dimensions of gender inequality. We're tackling the whole question of culture and religion. Does gender inequality have a cultural and religious dimension? Why is it so pervasive? Why is it that in most countries women are second-class citizens? Why is it that it's taking so long to address this problem head-on? So I think it's a nice attempt on our part, to basically contribute to this debate. And I hope you read it.
Yes, and
it's available in Amazon.
Fantastic. And the title again?
Equality for Women Equals Prosperity for All.
With an equals sign right there, right?
Yes, with an equal sign. Yeah.
Equals prosperity for all. Augusto Lopez Claros and Bahia Nakhjavani. Thank you so much, Augusto, for this fascinating presentation and this list of ways that the extremes of wealth and poverty can be reduced in the world. And I hope that in the future we will see more and more countries implementing these kinds of changes.